I would like to begin my talk with a sort of honest, I would call it honest diagnosis or a diagnostical statement. I'm arguing actually that, that the historical horizon that was opened by these, these events, 89-90, called the so-called democratic revolutions of 89-90, that this historical horizon is now closed. Or to put it more concretely, the thesis is that the so-called transition to democracy, post-communist transition to democracy, or much stronger terms, the whole teleology of this transitional process. Teleology, which is, this quasi-self-evident belief that Western type liberal democracy in a harmonic relation to the neoliberal capitalism is the only game in the town, is an option, the only option on our historical horizon. This is how this horizon was opened with only one this option, and the East was simply expected to follow this path. This diagnosis, of course, probably contradicts. It's a counterfactual, especially. For instance, here in Estonia, yesterday we took Uber, and the driver, he himself opened the topic. He was not asked, but he told us, well, it's a 30 times better than during the Soviet times, and then corrected himself saying, no, it's a 30,000 times better from in comparison to the Soviet times. And I was like thinking, well, coming from a former Yugoslavia and having in mind, this part, Bosnia, etc., probably people would say that it is 30,000 times worse than it was in communist time. But my point is not to focus on a concrete historical experience, because this they are different. As the communism was different, as today's conditions are different from country to country, society, so from class to class. Also, we usually don't use this notion of class. So, for instance, one can say that in some parts of former Yugoslavia, the process of a post-communist transition to democracy failed before it began, already, at the very moment, that there was no transition whatsoever. But now, you remember yesterday we opened actually this conference with a talk on George Soros and his role. And you remember my intervention was just to remind you, I wanted to remind you that George Soros actually started his philanthropic activity, regardless of how much ideological package was within, his belief in a liberal democracy, etc., etc. Already 1984 in a communist Hungary, and only now, like this year, he is finally, or the project is over. The Open Society Institute moved to Berlin. While we are speaking, they are now moving to Berlin, and the Central European University will move to Vienna. Whether it will stay in Vienna, looking at the changes in Austria, it's an open question. But if you think of this, George Soros is 88, regardless of what we think of his role and then as a financial capitalist, etc., you see that his life project is over. This is the end. He has failed, and there is no time rest to start it again. This is what I mean, that tautology is collapsed. So we are gathering here to talk about the 90s, not from the perspective from the historical moment after the collapse of communism, but after the collapse of the post-communism. This is what I'm suggesting is this historical and conceptual also shift. So, when and how it went wrong would be the question. And I think also in the way how it was understood and conceptualized from the very beginning, this historical event, the collapse of communism, or how they called it at that time, the democratic revolutions of the 1890. Already 1990, German left liberal philosopher Jürgen Habermas wrote an article under the title, would be a German translation would be catching up revolution, die nachholende Revolution. The idea is, and he explicitly says it, that the societies of Eastern Europe now, this is the 1990, after the obstacle of communist system and one party rule is removed, now got a chance to catch up with the missed development, both in terms of a way of life of Western societies, Western Europe, European Union, etc., but also in terms of catching up with the legacies of bourgeois revolution, French revolution, in terms of rule of law, human rights, etc., etc. The problem was, however, that at that very moment, with this definition, we got like two Europes divided by different temporalities. One part, the Western part, was in its own history, on time, while the Eastern part was belated in terms of a need to catch up with the West. So, what is very curious, there were from the very beginning attempts to clearly measure this time of catching up, of transition, the process of transition. And one most interesting is by Ralph Dahrendorf, or Lord Dahrendorf, one of the leading, not German, but European at that time, liberal philosopher and political scientist. He was famous already, 67, there was this TV discussion with Rudi Dutschke, shortly before 68 revolts in Germany, in Europe, when he opposed Rudi Dutschke, saying there are chances now 67 for a radical liberal reform and not for your revolution, opposing directly. And it was interesting because Rudi Dutschke, conceived at that discussion this concept of the long march through the institutions. And as you know, next year, Rudi Dutschke was shot in the head, hardly survived, and later escaped to United Kingdom, but was kicked out. The United Kingdom didn't accept him as a migrant from Germany, while Ralph Dahrendorf made it up to the House of Lords. He really made this march through the institutions, and now 1990 he sees that his concepts, that his worldview are in moment of realization, final realization. And in the book published in the same year, 1990, this is the beginning of this decade, the book is Reflections on the Revolution in Europe. He writes that the process of transition, the post-communist societies, he writes, need 6 months for establishing the constitutional and political framework, which means, new rules, constitutions, laying down the basic values of statehood, etc. And he calls it, these first 6 months, the hour of the lawyers. Then post-communist society need 6 years for constructing the rudiments of a true market economy, juridical guarantees for anti-monopolism, economic rivalry, etc., etc., so as to start the market economy, and he calls it the hour of the economist. And finally, they will need 60 years for the final implementation of a free democratic society relying on the power of its well-developed civil society. He calls it the hour of the citizen. The hour of the citizen was supposed to last 60 years. So if you think you are not even the half of this time, so I won't, if this would have been truth, there would be beyond my lifetime, and the young people who were 1990 and who were probably leading this book and this text, they will just, oh wow, I will live in democracy at the end of my life. But this is how he constructed, how he measured. You know, he is the subject that measures the time of the other. So, but this also would mean that the East would need 60 years to catch up with the West. It is very, very, very clear. But in the meantime, it is clear these two parts of the world, or if you allow me to call it normative identity blocks, the West and the East, remain different. One of them belated, historically belated. So this is interesting. This is not the first time that East and West are separated in terms of different histories, different temporalities. Just to remind you that Hegel put it very, very clearly in his concept of universal history, of world history, in his philosophy of history. The universal historical time, according to Hegel, follows the course of the sun. Die Morgenröte des Geistes ist im Osten im Aufgang, der Geist ist aber nur in ihr Niedergang. The dawn of the spirit is in the Orient, where it starts, you know, in Orient, but the spirit in its reality, in its actuality, the spirit is in the West, in its setting. And for Hegel, Asian civilization actually lacked the moment of the subjective spirit. This is one stage in the dialectical development of universal history, and they generally lack this, but they are somehow included in the dialectical articulation of the universal history as one dialectical moment, a stage in this one-way development. But not always the Western thought, not always thought in terms of these temporal differences. One interesting example provides actually Karl Jaspers, existential philosopher. 49 in his Vom Ursprung und Ziel der Geschichte, The Origin and Goal of History, this is an attempt to deconstruct the universal paradigm of history and the very, this dyad, West and East. And actually 30 years before, ahead of Edward Said's Orientalism. And in the book, he presented his theory of convergence of global cultures beyond the presumed dualism of Western knowledge and Eastern wisdom. You know, the deepness of subjective feeling, while the concept's rational on the West. Yeah. Central to his thesis is the so-called, the thesis on the so-called Achsenzeit, actual period between 800 and 200 before Christ, when within during this time, three different civilizations, China, India, and Europe, made this, brought about this turn or passage from the mythos to the logos. But what is interesting, synchronically, not one is the first, another is the second, but all three during this time. For Jaspers, India, China, and Occident, or we would say these different cultures, Indian, Chinese, today we would say, Western cultures, are not successive dialectical stages in the evolution of spirit, as it is presented in Hegel's philosophy of lessons on the philosophy of history. But what Jaspers argues, he still sees the preeminence of Western rationalism. However, he criticizes the way in which the West, concretely Europe, justifies its preeminent position. It namely does so by shifting from the factual sphere of the will to power to the ethical moment. You know, this is what we still today hear as any time when you hear the Western values, so-called as the very essence of Western identity, where the identity is defined by the values. Jaspers would say, well, it's not about values, it's the will to power. Der Wille zur Macht, to use Nietzschean original concept. This is what the West, so to say, suppresses and mistakes in its own perspective the will to power for a value, for an ethical moment. Well, this, however, was possible only for Jaspers on the ground of a radically different form of symbolic identification. While most other civilizations characterize themselves as the center of the world, like China, India, Europe, this third cultural identity, identifies itself only through its relation to the East. In other words, Europe constitutes itself through an inner, I quote Jaspers, polarity of Orient and Occident. The antithesis between Orient and Occident is in fact an exclusive mythical, symbolical property of the Occident, a typical Western dualism that is not met with in other cultures. So, while other cultures might define themselves in terms of a certain essentialism, Europe, to define, to feel its identity, needs the opposition to the East. This is the idea of Jaspers. And the opposition between Asia and Europe, between the East and the West, which is rooted in the self-consciousness of the Greeks since the time of Herodotus, is in fact alien to the civilizations of the far East, he states, unless they are colonized by the West, until they became subject to the process of Western colonization and modernization. It was a result of this process that the elites of the Far East coined the formula of the so-called Asian values. So, Asian values are actually imported by the West through the colonialism in the hearts and minds of the so-called Eastern peoples. For Jaspers, to conclude, the notion of the West intrinsically implies the difference between the West and the East. What we call Western reason is in general inconceivable without this internal polarity. To use Jaspers' own words, I quote, "The West only continues to exist as long as it keeps its eyes steadily on the East, faces up to it, comprehends it, and withdraws from it." The whole dynamics of the West is defined by its relation to the East, which is interesting. Jaspers is a quite forgotten philosopher, and in these terms here, a cultural theorist. But one important point, probably the most important point of history, of his theory, is this synchronicity. This is not how Habermas understands it. This is not how Hegel understands it. because they divide West and the East in terms of different temporalities. But in case of Jaspers, it's the synchronicity, it's same temporality, shared temporality of the cultures. This is interest. So, and in these terms, Jaspers generally opposes Western historicism, ideology of Western historicism. And as such, it implies a specific critique of the anthropological discourse. More precisely, it implies a critique of the temporal dimension of anthropological difference. And I have in mind this famous book by Johannes Fabian, Time and the Other, from 83, 83, How Anthropology Makes in Its Objects. His main thesis is that the referent of the anthropological discourse, meaning the other, is not simply somewhere else, but always already in another time, projected into another time. So that the subject of the anthropological discourse, of the knowledge of anthropology, and its referent and its object never share one and the same time. And he calls it the denial of coevalness. So the concept is of the concept of coevalness, which means active sharing of time, same time. This is not what is the case in a post-communist concept of transition to democracy. The West and the East do not share one and the same time. They don't live in the same time. And so the difference between the West and the East has this epistemological dimension that implies necessarily a temporal difference, but it implies also ahistoricity. I rely now on some researches and texts by a colleague and friend of mine, Slovenian philosopher Rastko Močnik, who wrote in a text that, speaking of the West-East divide, which has actually survived the Cold War, he pointed at its ideological function. That this divide has an ideological function, which is to rob both sides of their history. Both sides. The West, as he said, appears as emancipated from the history as such. It's an ahistorical space. The West is always on time, or in terms of Dahrendorf concept of the temporality of the post-communist transition, it is the very measure of time. The West is the measure of time, while the East is belated. But not only belated, East has a history which is of no value whatsoever, which is the history of its belatedness. You know, you can think simply also in terms what it means, the communist history of Estonia, and we have heard now, you know, this, yes, it is the separation from the West, and it is some sort of wasted time, you know, time which is of no value. Why should you remember the time which is the time of being late, of wasted time? So contrary, the Western, of course, the Western temporality is a canonic. It is imposed as general. And contrary to this, the notion of the East functions as a form of amnesia, for its primal goal is to get rid of its history, which is, again, of no value whatsoever, and to become an ahistorical space like the West. So the East has history, but a history that would be better forgotten, for it is but the experience of its historical belatedness. As a result, Močnik concludes, both sides are robbed of their history. Moreover, they are prevented from having a common history in the future. which is a problem. We now open this perspective to the futural perspective, and the question is open. If it's the different temporalities, when will the coevalness come? When there will be an active sharing of one and the same temporality? Having in mind both the general ahistoricity of the post-communist condition, and you know it is not by chance. At that same time, Fukuyama publishes this text, famous text. He is eclectic. He is not first to come to the idea of post-historicity. The Alexander Kojev, the migrant, you know, from Russia, who actually educated during the 30s in his lectures on Hegel, the French philosophy that those, you know, from Sartre and all, they went to his lectures. He, according to his theory, the European history ends with Napoleon. And after that, because Napoleon laid ground for a universal state, and Kojev even, he truly believed in the concept of post-history, and he believed that there makes no sense for philosophy after the end of history, and he became the clerk of the European, at that moment, emerging, you know, European Union, the late 40s, and he was you know, traveling through the world and making photographies, and Boris Groys, a few years later, made an exhibition, curated an exhibition with the photographies of Alexander Kojev. But 48, Kojev wrote a letter to Stalin because he believed that Stalin and the European Union both are creating this new universal state that will replace nations, etc., etc. I'm just saying, you know, that Fukuyama is not that original as we believe, although there are very interesting moments in his theory which are very productive for understanding even these topics we are discussing here. Like, you know, when he says, at the end of this famous article on the end of history, he says that in the post-historical period, there will be no art and no philosophy, just perpetual caretaking of the history of the past. So the world is sort of archive, and we are all like curators in the, regardless whether we are artists or philosophers, we are curators in the museum of history, which is interesting because you know how much art today is obsessed with the past, not only art. So. But the question is, you know, if you think, who was supposed at that time during the 90s to realize this dream about catching up the West? Of course, the elites, both political and intellectual elites. Political elites, really in terms of compradorial elites. The elites that help the metropolis, you know, to include the excluded East, precisely in terms of this transition, you know, to be the subjects of this transition, to impose the rule of law, to impose market economy, etc., etc., to, you know, generate a new, fresh civil society. But on the other side, intellectuals, artists, cultural workers, and especially those who were subjects of some sort of knowledge production and humanist knowledge, you know, they became what Spivak calls, and this is also an anthropological concept, native informants. Native informants who provide the raw material of experiences for the Western concepts. And this is still time, you know, where the so-called area studies haven't yet, you know, it's the awareness that area studies were actually created in a way by Americans, by CIA, and the concept of the post-Second World War, conquering of the world. It was not. There was shortly an exhibition in HKW in Berlin about the role of secret services, Western secret services, in creating this left, liberal, dissident environment, cultural, intellectual, in Europe and in the world after the Second World War, and financing these researches also in terms of historical way how we understand history. For instance, Brodel was financed by, I think, Fulbright Foundation, etc., etc. But anyway, my point is, so the role, this was the role of the intellectuals from the East to provide, to supply indigenous knowledge to colonial subjects, and thus to facilitate exchange between the metropolis and the nation or country of origin. Spivak actually calls it a foreclosed native informant, because in her critique of the post-colonial reason, but meaning that this figure is absent, it's not visible in the humanist knowledge as it is produced, because it structures this knowledge. This is why it is not simply suppressed, but foreclosed. But the point is, in other words, there is no innocent knowledge production. We must therefore become aware of its complicity, and in Spivak's terms, it's a complicity with imperialist or neo-imperialist projects, or I quote, we have to acknowledge a responsibility toward the trace of the other, not to mention toward other struggles. But I'm, repeating this notion of innocence, that there is no innocent knowledge production. Moreover, there is no innocence in history, in the realm of history. However, the claim to innocence is an interesting, intrinsic part of the post-communist discourse. And we heard it yesterday, Ekaterina, in her talk about, this world simplified and reduced to one single relation between perpetrators and victims, and this need of the East to present its identity in terms of its self-victimization. This whole the phenomena which is omnipresent in cultural production, in the way how memory cultures are articulated, etc. But even, if you analyze, and a colleague of mine, I wrote it in my book, he analyzed not the discourse of the post-communist transition, but its jargon or its rhetorics. And he found out something very interesting, that there is a curious set of metaphors that accompany the post-communist, the rhetorics of, or the jargon of the post-communist transition. And just I quote few of them so that you get an idea. Education for democracy, classrooms of democracy, democratic exams, democracy that is growing and maturing, but which might still be in diapers, or making its first steps, or of course, suffering from children's illnesses. So you see, the East is presented in terms of being some sort of a child. And there is, and I will now, as probably some of you recognize already, it is Sergei Bratkov, the photographer. I wrote an essay on his work, and I will use his actually photographic work to deal with this problem of innocence. And I would like also continue, this Larry, the problem of the images. And as you presented yesterday, how the image of the East was created by the children's perspective, through the children's, from the child's perspective. But I would, there are images, but there is always a gaze or the gaze, and the dialectical relation and dynamic between the gaze and the image. So as what you see, this is the serial of photographies called Birds from 1997. It is an orphanage. I don't know, somewhere, probably Ukraine or Belarusia, I don't know, it's not important, somewhere in the post-Soviet space. Orphanage. And so you see that this is the picture of children. Just to stress one more important moment, this ideological structure of post-communism and the metaphor of the child plays actually a crucial role in it. It stands for the idea of a new beginning, fresh, new beginning, for the intrinsic innocence of the concept democracy rediscovered, and this is how 89 was also described. But at the same time, as you know, the children stand for the infantile character of Eastern European societies, freed from totalitarianism, and they stand also for the coming of age they have yet to reach in history, to catch up, to grow through. The post-communist individual may be the child of a democratic revolution on the brink of a great future, but at the same time, and for that very same reason, a child in need of cossetting and of guidance. And this reminds us immediately on the definition, old Kant's definition of Aufklärung, of enlightenment, which was, as Ausgang, as exit from the self-incurred immaturity, Unmündigkeit, which is self-incurred. This is how he defined the Aufklärung, and defined it as the inability to use one's own understanding, reason, without the guidance of the other. So, playing with the metaphor of a child, it's quite a tricky issue. You are very, very deep into the concepts of history, of maturity, immaturity, etc. But this is also what we should have in mind when confronted with this, I'm saying, tragicomic metaphors of children, of people, of adult people who now have to, make their first steps to learn something as though they don't know. It is especially, painful if you think that actually the East European societies liberated themselves from the totalitarian rule. And the whole Western, military systems, and, all the generals, all the theorists and politicians and banks invested so much in conquering and defeating the Eastern communism, but actually the peoples from the East did it with their bare hands at the end. And now these people suddenly became children, in need of protection, etc., etc. With their teething troubles or taking their first steps. So just you look, you have this picture of children. Bratkov's photographs offer the post-communist gaze the image of a child in need of, precisely, orphans, in need of care, guidance, and protection. These little orphans, adorably cute in their innocence, they stir up feelings of simple parental love. We identify with parents, with those who will protect and take care of these children. So you see them. However, it becomes a little bit ambivalent, and then suddenly there is, you see, the children are not that nice and cute, and these are the glue sniffers, the series from 2000. It's a glue sniffers, you know, the distorted faces of the glue-sniffing street children at that time on the streets in Eastern Europe. Now they evoke pity, but also horror. This same innocence cries out for help. The gaze of the enlightened social improver. Kant's call for moral and social responsibility springs to mind here. The gaze determines that something has to be done. You know, you have the problem. Indeed, but what? But what? And you see this glue sniffers. This is the Mickey Mouse 2001 photograph, portrait of a juvenile delinquent. And you see, the innocence has been lost. There is no longer this innocence. It's not about protecting a child from society. In the gaze, you see, in the gaze, it's about protecting society from this child. From what would appear to be a profligate, irredeemably profligate child. Here it is already too late for love and solidarity. It's time for order to sweep aside chaos and for the right combination of educational and punitive measures to be applied. And then, but the next 2000, Kids, the series Kids. Now, so we have now we have shifted from the image to the gaze. The post-communist gaze now identifies through the image of social deprivation with the standpoint of immaculate innocence. Now, my thesis is that the innocence moves from the image to the gaze. It's now innocent gaze. But this is the next, the Kids series. And then we see you know, the kids' portrait of children in a carefully staged lascivious poses. This time, they are clearly offering themselves as sexual objects. Just this is the series Kids. Yeah. Certainly, not to an innocent gaze. Gaze is not innocent. It's a pedophile gaze. It is here no trace of innocence remains. The gaze becomes complicit in the moral corruption of both sides, or of both sitter and the spectator. The image has set a trap, exposing the nature of perversion and voyeurism. That's what you want, isn't it? This is the child now asking. The child has finally learned the language, and the doing so has made itself the subject. So in Bratkov's portraits, the child makes the journey from a passive, innocent object, invoking pity and calling for protection and salvation, to a responsible subject capable of criticizing its own world, but also capable of being evil, you know, of seduce. This is how it is subjectifying. The image of post-communism has dared to confront the gaze, and with that to embark on reflection, on reflection and self-reflection. What emerges clearly in this is the perverse truth of the post-communist gaze. Lust, avarice, abuse, and exploitation as the flip side of the altruistic paternalism of the post-communist world. This is what is absent, you know, from the allegedly innocent gaze. And then finally comes there are a series of photographies with the secretaries and princesses. These are the secretaries. 2001, you see and there are also the princesses. I don't have this. Now, these pin-up poses when former child now offers itself as a sexual object, offering themselves up in a despairingly sleazy poses like so many post-communist Cinderellas to Western Prince Charmings. I will close it with actually a quote, Hegel's quote from Phenomenology of the Spirit. When he says that there is actually no such thing as innocence. The innocence is possible only as an absolute inactivity. And he states, in German, innocent is nicht einmal ein Kind. Not even a child is innocent. Saying only a stone, an inactivity of a stone is innocent. And I think this is a good quote to close this, and also to comment on this, you know, non-dialectical, naive pair of contradiction between the perpetrators and victims and the whole discourse of innocence. This is, you know, where there is innocence, there is no history. The idea of innocence is intrinsically, essentially, something non-historical. There is no innocence in history. Thank you.